when I started researching this presentation, I realized that Marconi was just one of several what I've chosen to call supporters, the people who actually supported the few in their very, very genuine sacrifice that's been talked about quite a lot. And one has to realize that without the supporters, they wouldn't have been able to do their job. So I decided I would call the presentation The Supporters of the Few, of which one is Marconi. Now, the first thing we have to do is to look at the situation that existed in the summer of 1940. Hitler's armed forces had completed, as we said, the fall of France, and he ordered them to continue moving west and prepare for what he wanted to do, which was invade the UK, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. Now, if he wanted to do this successfully, he had to have control of the air, because unlike the rest of his progress, which across Europe had been by blitzkrieg and his tanks across land, he had to come across the channel to get to Britain, and tanks don't float very well. So he had to take control of the air so he could bring a battalion of ships over safely. Now, at that point in time, in 1939, the UK government was well aware what was coming. And in fact, just as a reminder, Churchill had one of his famous speeches, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth will last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour." And in fact, it turned out to be that. Now, the subsequent major aerial operation, which the Germans mounted, actually started on the 10th of July, and it lasted through until the 31st of October. And that is the period that we're celebrating now, called the Battle of Britain, although that actually lasted far longer. And in that period, about 3,000 multinational, and not forget that, multinational RAF pilots repelled all the sorties of the RAF, of the Luftwaffe, that were mounted over Britain in that period. Now, we had actually seen that coming, and the situation had been anticipated. And so various proactive measures had been put in place, which involved the supporting crews that scrambled the fighter planes, and also thousands of other people who operated the ground defenses to engage with the enemy. And it is the story of them that I really want to cover tonight, as the flyers have been covered quite a lot in other things. So we now have the few and the supporters. The few, of course, gets their name from Churchill for the names of the pilots who flew the Spitfires and the Hurricanes. And what I've chosen to call the supporters, in fact, were officials, scientists, engineers, all those who in fact banded together and built a completely new detection and control system. There were also the service personnel who manned the radar stations that came up, the operations rooms for the RAF, and the radio stations, which were also part of the support. But we mustn't forget there were also the Royal Observer Corps, and in fact the General Post Office. And it was rather pleasing tonight that one of the TV programs actually recognized that the Post Office were involved. And finally, of course, we had the aircraft manufacturers, the Air Transport Authority, who actually delivered them, and the ground crews. So what were the support activities that the RAF needed? Well, first of all, of course, we needed to detect the oncoming enemy, and that was carried out through the Observer Corps and a whole set of new technologies, of which Marconi was involved in quite a few. On the ground, we had the control of all the defences, which was the organisation of which service was required, the selection of the appropriate service, the notification of the targets, how to get to them to intercept them, and finally the recovery of the fighter force. So first of all, we have the Royal Observer Corps. Now, they traditionally used optical, infrared, and acoustic detectors to warn them of approaching aircraft, and they'd been doing this for quite some time, so they were quite well practiced at it. But unfortunately, in the terms of modern warfare, remembering, as I shall cover a little later, most of this dated, in fact, from the First World War, they had nothing like the performance that was needed to cope with modern aircraft. They had very poor sensitivity, very limited range, and were very weather dependent, of course. So there was some new method was needed to be able to cope with the modern Air Force, which is what the Luftwaffe had. They did have one or two rather exceptional bits of kit, and this is one of them. It's what they called an acoustic detector or sound mirror, and it was a vast concrete thing sitting on the south coast. And hopefully what you had was a microphone placed at the focus of this arc, and they could hear the engines of an approaching aircraft, but only to about 8 miles an hour, and only if the wind was in the right direction. So that wasn't really very much use. We need to now look at the timelines that were involved in this exercise. In fact, the first aerial bombing of England was in 1914, and it continued right through the war until 1918. And because of that, it did stimulate the creation of what became the world's first strategic air defense system. And what went on then actually carried on and influencing all the work throughout the 20s and the 30s. Now, it featured the use of aerial radio telephony. And of course, that, if you like, is the first Marconi development. The war had started with ground-to-air wireless telegraphy. It then went on to ground-to-air wireless telephony. It then came to air-to-ground telephony. And finally, in about 1917, we had air-to-air telephony. So all through war, Marconi systems were involved in continuous development. There was also the development of this central command structure, which we'd mentioned before. So you could gather and then disseminate information to regional controls with plot spotting on a map. So that is in fact not a new idea. However, despite all of this work, this general feeling was summed up under, there's this famous 1932 statement by Stanley Baldwin, the bomber will always get through. However, a lot of people thought this wasn't exactly so, although the RAF carried out, or yes, it was the RAF by then, carried out an exercise in 1934. And unfortunately, about half of the bombers just got through with absolutely no interference. So the opinion started to be felt to be justified. But nevertheless, another organization, the Air Defence of Great Britain, was coordinating the ideas of the defensive and offensive forces. The new Air Force, and it wasn't new, of course, having been the Royal Air Corps, actually was very well ahead of the game, because in 1924, it actually created its own Directorate of Scientific Research, and they appointed as its director a gentleman by the name of Henry Wimperis. Now, you'll notice here that I've actually highlighted dates in red, and I've done this throughout the presentation so you can see how things progressed rather rapidly towards the end and not too slowly at the beginning. Because in November 1934, Wimperis formed this Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defence, CSSAD. Now, this also became known as the Tizard Committee because Tizard was its chairman. And later on, we have notice of the Tizard Commission that went to America and, in effect, more or less brought America into the war. Now, Wimperis's immediate superior, being in the RAF, was Air Marshal Hugh Dowding. And that is an extremely important name, which will reoccur frequently throughout the whole of this presentation. Now, in 1935, Wimperis learned of some work going on by Robert Watson Watt, who became a familiar name, of course, on ionospheric radio research. And this was at the Ditton Park Radio Research Station at Slough. Now, all the way through the period since Marconi, in fact, had been working on radio, there had been links with the radio wave and propagation section set up at Baddow. And we now have another Eckersley brother, this time Thomas Eckersley. In the summer, we were learning about Peter Eckersley and the radio in Melba. Now we have Thomas Eckersley, who was a research scientist at Baddow, specializing in radio wave propagation, together with another gentleman called George Millington, of whom we'll hear later. And it was because of this links that, in fact, in the end, during one of his papers, Millington actually says they are never quite sure with the connection between Slough and Baddow who invented what when. So it was a very close coordination between Marconi and what was in fact a government establishment. Now, because of certain events that happened on the 15th of February, 1935, Wimperis proposed to Dowding, who was the Air Member for Supply and Research for the government, that he should get £10,000 funding to be expended to investigate a new method of detection. Now, it's that which you are going to have a look at next. The Tizard Committee that we've just talked about was set up to examine ideas, and one of the favourite ones back in that period was the so-called radio wave death ray. Various people, including people like H.G. Wells, had put this idea into the public mind that it would be possible to send out a wave of radio rays and they would either damage the pilot or the aircraft engine or both, preferably. It was really a crazy idea, but it had to be looked at. And what happened was, at Slough, Arnold Wilkinson, who was set up by Robert Watson Watt, was asked to carry out a calculation as to whether enough power could be fired from the ground to an aircraft to have any effect. And they decided no, it couldn't. There was no way that that amount of power could be derived either then or probably even now. But one of the things they had noticed was that with aircraft flying around while they were carrying out their experiments at Slough, they did get sort of rather odd disturbances. Now, if those disturbances could be actually utilized, they could possibly be used for the detection of aircraft. And so Arnold was asked to carry out some calculations if there was actually a useful effect. And when he did this, he actually got quite an encouraging result, I think partly to the surprise of many people. Although it was in the range of milliwatts returned from the kilowatts that went out, it was detectable. When Wimperis reported this to Dowding, Dowding said, yes, well, okay, but I would like to see a practical experiment. I want to be convinced before I put up this 10,000 to do anything that it actually works. So there then happened that a practical extension of the Daventry experiment, it was called, and it was mounted by a team from the Slough Research Station, possibly in connection again with Marconi at Baddow, but we don't quite know that. So we come to the Daventry experiment, and this was in February 1935, so we moved on a little. Now the picture here is a representation of what actually happened. They had this radio equipment mounted in this little van in a field. They'd rigged up a sort of an aerial structure, which you can just make out with the poles in the ground. And they had this aircraft, which was a bomber flying along. And where they were parked was near the BBC Daventry radio station. So what they hoped was that as the bomber flew through the beam of the radio station, the people in the van would be able to see effects of some sort or other. And in fact, it did. The Hayford flew on tracks between the site and the Daventry transmitter. And as he did so, the spot on their cathode ray oscilloscope on the screen in the van moved up and down. And they continued to do this until it was about 8 miles away. Now, this is maybe one of the areas where Marconi had an influence, because Millington in his records, does talk about being involved in the design of oscilloscopes for this period. So it's just possible it was a piece of Marconi kit. But the main thing was it demonstrated to Dowding's satisfaction that without doubt an aircraft could be detected by this radio wave system. This is sufficiently interesting, in fact, to have had a memorial now mounted, and this is a photograph of it on the wall of the field where it happened. And in fact, on the 75th anniversary, on the 26th of Feb 2010, Coventry Amateur Radio Society mounted an experiment and showed that, in fact, it all did work as recorded. So away we go. I mentioned Dowding several times, and this is very important because what we're talking about now became known as the Dowding system. And it is this really that carried us through the period from the 1930s into the start of the war and on, and actually was at the heart of the success of the Battle of Britain. Now, he was well suited to be in charge of this sort of thing because he'd actually participated in aerial combat in World War I. And so he knew firsthand what was actually involved. And in the 19s and 20s and 30s, he was in various posts, but eventually he became officer commanding the RAF Fighter Command. And of course, they would be the people who would have to do the interception of any enemy. Because of his involvement with the committee, he was able to initiate funding for further work by the NPL, having seen this experiment, and additional teams which came along a little later and would culminate in the development and trial of this new detection system that Wimperis had mentioned. Now, in parallel with what was going on here, there were continuing trials in the technology of wireless direction finding, which had been in use, of course, from World War I. And this included what became known as the Biggin Hill experiment, which was another use of radio. So, the Dowding system. The Biggin Hill trials and others like it increased the accuracy and speed of the position determination of the fighters, and it used something called the pipsqueak direction finding navigation system, of which more later, together with a first initial development of a method of identifying aircraft, identification friend or foe, and we'll talk about that a bit later, because it actually stimulated the idea of airborne detection, and this followed the main daytime area when the nighttime combat came later. They combined this with an enlarged telephone system because they had used telephony on the ground during World War I. They brought in the existing observer corps, and there was a whole new discipline of research of what was called operational research to enhance the control room structure that we'd got mentioned at the beginning, to form a new command and control system, as we would now call it, to enable the direction of the fighters onto the German attacks using these new technologies that were being developed. The main advantage being that meant that the fighters did not have to maintain standing patrols, which of course gave them limited operational time. Because of this, and taking advantage of the fact that they were fighting above home territory, the RAF in the end was able to deny German the air superiority, and it saved the UK from invasion and dealt the Axis a really major defeat early in the Second World War by winning the Battle of Britain. So the Dowding system really was at the heart of this whole structure. All of this is depending on a technical development, and therefore it's worthwhile looking at what had happened post-World War I. Because this new work was so secret, it was decided that the R&D, which carried on from this period, would in fact be carried out only within existing or specially set up government establishments, with a few very exceptions. So this is why all the work that we're talking about initially did not get handed out to industry. Only bits and pieces of production work, not knowing what it was for, in fact, in many cases, was handed out to industry. The conception from the original thoughts carried out at Slough and the assembly of the systems was carried out entirely within these special units. This carried right through until 1940-41, except where one or two major structures were considered. After that time, R&D work was handed out, and a few selected companies were involved, including MWC, AEI, DECA, and COSA, as we'll hear talked about a little later. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. So carrying on with the technical development, by the start of World War II in 1939, most of the UK radio industry had actually been taken under the direction of the government. Under that direction, all these major companies were asked to concentrate on particular branches of technology. Now, this shows where Marconi, in fact, originally was involved not on radar particularly, but on shortwave transmitters, comms receivers, special antennae, and some special manufacture, because they really had a lot of war work on communications, which of course was Marconi's speciality. Only later was it extended to work which included work on the cavity magnetron. However, what did happen was that the Badeau laboratories were completely taken over. In fact, they were described as having disappeared under camouflage. And it became the home, particularly, of the Inter-Services Ionospheric Bureau for Work on Propagation, which had developed from the cooperation between Eckersley's team at Badeau and the team at Slough. And this is why Marconi had this pervasive influence all the way through the war, because what happened at Slough and the subsequent developments almost certainly actually had some work carried on at Badeau, but because Badeau was totally secret and separated from the company in effect, it didn't get credited at the time to the company. Now, COSA, in fact, became involved in receivers, and DECA on navigation aids, which followed the development of radar with the G and oboe structures and things like that. Other companies did get involved. AEI was one of the first because they, in fact, built and designed the first of the transmitters that went into what became the initial radar station. Everybody else was directed into some piece of work for Navy and also areas in the Army. So to keep the work going, basically what happened was that the work at Slough was transferred onto the Norfolk coast for two reasons. One is that they wanted it separated from the other research going on at Slough. Secondly, this was in the area where, of course, if an attack came, it was going to come on that coast from the continent. And so they established as a government place that's already in existence, had been from the First World War, to look at how this system was going to work. And the main thing was they're having to look at pulse transmission. So they developed prototypes, they carried out tests, and it was at this time that the code name of RDF, which was supposedly stood for radio defection finding, came in rather to hide what it was going to be actually used for. The aerial system they designed, they had pairs of 75-foot wooden lattice masts on which they mounted the dipole structures. They had another pair sited near the building for the transmitter work. And for the receivers, rather remembering that it was based on the direction finding structures, they had 4 masts set at the corners of a rectangle within which the receiver building was situated. Having got this set up and running by May 1935, very shortly after the February date, they got out to detection ranges of 17 miles and very rapidly got out to 30 miles. So progress was being made quite well. In fact, by July 1935, they'd gone out to 40 miles. They'd had to consider all sorts of parameters and found out that the wavelength of 50 meters for best reflections from aircraft, this was actually related to the known dimensions of the aircraft wing of a German plane. So effectively, those who know about radio means this was a half wave effect of the air. They then looked at 25 meters and 12 meters, all related to this same dimension. And for each of these, they had to design and build new transmitters and receivers and set up a whole new set of aerials. So it was quite a complicated process at this little place on Orford Ness. Just to give you some idea of what was actually coming in, this is the signal that they were getting back. On the oscilloscope screen, they would get this line, which was representing the pulse going out and coming back, as we now know in radar. And the blips were just where the reflections, the very small milliwatt reflections from the aircraft came in. So the one almost nearer the transmitter on the left, of course, was rather bigger than the ones further out, but the size was also related to the size of the aircraft. So you've got this very assembly of blips, but where they occurred along the trace, of course, represented the range. And what they were able to do was have an upward pointed marker trace, which was under the control of a knob. And by turning this pointer and putting the blip over, that would give them an idea of what the range of the aircraft was, which is how they were measuring these results that they were getting. What we call the prime position indicator, the circular rotating radar trace, came much, much later. So this is the sort of trace that all the operators in what became Chain Home were working to, a very simple presentation. Now, that is giving you the range. Now, the range by itself, of course, is not much use. If you're going to get a defighter to the best position to engage the enemy, you've got to work in 3 dimensions. So you therefore to get bearing and height, and of course, you've got to be related to time as well. That was fair enough. To get the height, they had to do some mathematics. So they had to use the angle of elevation of the target and get this from time difference between signals mounted by aerials at different heights on these masts. And they were tuning these to check the difference. And they mainly used a phase representative. This wasn't the best way they found, so eventually they went back to using signal strengths from the aerials, and this was what was subsequently used in the main system. They also decided to get the longer detection ranges they needed, and the RF was requesting something over 100 miles. They need much greater power from the transmitter and probably higher aerials to get the cover. Unfortunately, of course, the more power you put out from the transmitter, if you had the receivers too near, they suffered from saturation. So they judged it was going to be necessary to site each receiver several miles away from a transmitter. So the idea then was that they would have a central transmitter to floodlight the area out in front of where they wanted to see, and to put receivers on each side of this transmitter, but about 15 miles away. So you're talking about some quite extraordinarily large structure systems. Now, the map position of a target then had to be calculated by using the time differences between receiving the reflected signal from the target and the direct signal from the transmitter at each receiver. So there was quite a lot of maths involved. In September 1935, and this was not that long when you consider from the May-June time, Watson Watt decided that his team had made sufficient progress, and he put forward what is now his hysteric memorandum for a whole chain of stations to be erected around the UK coast. Now, this would then provide warning of attack in terms of timing and positional information to enable defensive fighters to be scrambled, as that's where the word was first used, and told where to engage the attackers, and thus avoid the need to maintain these standing patrols. Now, to do this, they had to get the effects of the height of the target, the height of the aerials, the wavelength of the transmissions, the power transmitted, and the receiver sensitivity. All of these parameters reflected on how the detection range could be evaluated. And after some trials, they concluded that using a wavelength of about 10 meters and aerial heights of under 500 feet would meet the RS requirements. Watson Watt went the whole hog, and he proposed that one full-scale station should be built so they could demonstrate the feasibility of this. And if it was successful, this would be followed by further stations to cover initially the Thames estuary and then finally by a chain covering the south and the east coasts. So this was quite a significant timing. By now, the nest had really got beyond what they could be coped with there, so they were looking for somewhere better to do it. And as it happened, just up the coast from Norfolk Ness, Bordsey Manor became available, and application was made, and eventually they decided they would actually buy it. And in September of 1935, the Air Defence Committee actually sanctioned its purchase for research work and as the headquarters for the organisation of this change of stations. And it in fact became the first of the stations, and it then became known as an Air Ministry research establishment. But on the outbreak of war, they renamed it as the Air Ministry Experimental Station, AMES. And those in the radar world will now know that as a familiar, because it became the prefix to all the types of radar that came. So the chain home was in fact Ames 1. So, having settled down at Bordsey, on the 28th of October, the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff actually held the first conference on how they were going to use this new detection tool. And very rapidly, on the 19th of December, the British Treasury appropriated £60,000. Now, in brackets there, you'll see I put 4.2 million, which is the cost in today's money, not an insignificant amount, to provide a chain of 5 stations covering the approaches to London, and that would be called Chain Home, which is where the Chain Home CH station name comes from. So each station, as decided, would have a central transmitter site, and there would be receiver sites on each side. Sites were chosen. Arthur Wilkins, in fact, did a lot of the survey work up and down the coast, and construction was actually put in hand. Now, at this point in time, carrying on from the work at Orford, they were going to have 240-foot high wooden lattice receiver towers and one similar tower, and these were actually designed by ministry engineers and installed by 2 installation units. What we now familiarly look at and call the towers, the steel towers and the Marconi masts, came much, much later. So the initial stations had wooden towers. By February 1936, a guide mast system had been erected and installed at Bordsey, together with the receiver systems. And in early March, ranges of 75 miles were being obtained from this station at Bordsey. They erected 2 more 240-foot masts back at Orford Ness to support another 6-element array, and they improved the performance even more. And in 1936, in the May, Bordsey Manor then really became the centre for all the following work. And because of that, they were able to find the solution to this receiver saturation. So transmitters and receivers could be operated in reasonably close proximity. They no longer needed to have this wide base. They also devised a method for measuring the target bearing by using a pair of cross dipoles, which will mean something to those in the radar world, for the receiver aerial. But they also found that if they used 2 pairs of cross dipoles mounted at different heights, this actually gave them a method of height finding. So now they could not only mount a complete station on one site, but they no longer had to carry out the complex calculations afterwards to actually put the aircraft they were looking for in the 3rd dimension. So now we get to what becomes familiar to everybody, chain home, or CH. And it was first applied to this string of stations along the East Coast. Now, sites had already been chosen on the basis of the separated transmitter receiver system, and they actually all started work on these. So it was decided to start with that these same sites, both receiver and transmitter, would be used for this new design of stations. By now, they had started handing out design and construction work to industry for these stations, because they were now too big to be carried out by this small group at Bordsey. But nevertheless, Bordersea staff were in full control. And the first 5 stations were to be at Dover, Dunkirk, Canewdon, of which we'll hear about later, Bordersea itself, and High Street in Suffolk. And later there would be an extension to the south coast and another extension to the west coast. The equipment now was beginning to appear in construction form, and on the left-hand picture you can see an East Coast transmitter. Now, those who are familiar with radio apparatus of the time will not be surprised by its size and complexity. It was quite strong stuff, and actually derived from a shortwave system that AEI had devised up here in Manchester, in fact, at their works, and by a Dr. Dodds, who is very well known in the valve world. On the right-hand side, you have the receiver system and display, which was actually designed by Cossa under the guidance of Bordsey. So they're quite large chunks of equipment. Now, while all this was going on in the sense of fitting the main system, Tizard had been carrying on looking at what was going on, and he decided that this, in fact, was going to work and that aircraft positional information would become available much sooner than most people actually thought it would. And so he actually went and talked directly to the RAF via Dowding, of course. And he said, can we not carry out theoretical and experimental studies of fighter control and interception so we can match what we can do with the fighters when we know where the enemy is? So they set up another study group at Biggin Hill and made arrangements for trials to start as soon as they were the fully operational RDS station. And of course, this happened to be Bordsey, and plans were made to test the new system. Now, at this point in time, of course, this was still highly secret. So to avoid any possible complicity with anybody else, they decided to intercept a completely unsuspecting aircraft rather than another RAF aircraft. So Bordsey had probably completely unofficially been plotting the tracks of civil airlines flying into the Croydon airport. And on that particular day that they wanted to carry the test, it happened to be a KLM flight. And to several people's surprise, a very perfect interception was made, to such an extent that no further tests were going to be carried out. But to counter the impression that they had come out to meet it, the fighters that were involved in this first test just carried on course as if nothing had happened. So by the summer of 1937, 20 initial CH stations were being checked out, and they were sufficient to carry out a major RAF exercise before the end of the year. And again, it was more successful than most people expected, but it was such a success that in fact £10 million, that is 700 million in today's terms, was appropriated by the Treasury for an eventual full chain of coastal stations, not just the initial 5. Now, at the start of 1938, because of this progress, the system actually was taken over by the F as an operational system. So it had moved out of the control of the Bordsey experimental people and into the hands of the RF as a complete working system. And it began regular operations. When the stations at Canewdon and Dover were completed, initially the first 2, it was revealed that the sites were so close together now that they gave considerable overlap in their cover. And this meant that because of the relatively low accuracy, even then, of the provisional data, the reports from these 2 stations were on the same aircraft could be mistaken for several different ones. And this, of course, was a source of confusion. If it was fed straight to some other central situations map trying to tell the fighters where to go, there would be considerable confusion. Now, this is the interesting part, because this is where the handover to the RAF to become an operational system starts to reveal how it's actually going to work and what problems could arise. So this, in fact, resulted in a complete new look at things, and they had this new concept which was called filtering. they decided that one way to eliminate this confusion between stations, what they would have to do was to introduce a preliminary map on which all the information received, and that is from the Observer Corps, the fighter DF system, which was being developed, as well as some of the RDF systems, was plotted and assessed, but looked at by experienced observers, not untrained people, but people who knew about this type of work, who could produce a weighted average and, as far as possible, determine the nature of each plot by saying, was it likely to be friendly, hostile, and how many aircraft were probably involved. Now, this is the intermediate step they decided to call filtering, and it was carried out in a filter room. The results then being passed on to the General Situations Map in Fighter Command Headquarters, so that the AOC could decide the action to be taken, which included, of course, the assignment of fighters from the different airfields. Each squadron in control of the aircraft then had to give more precise instructions by controllers watching this plot. So they were evolving this complete system. This is when we start to get to perhaps familiar pictures to some people. This is when you started to see these tables with people around them and poles poking flags and ideas and things on the table, but being watched by people who knew what it was that they were likely to be seeing and giving this first impression. Of course, it wasn't possible with all the sector controllers and the airfields to sit round at that same situation map. So they had to actually relay that information out to this lower level of command. And that was where the flight operators' orders were transmitted. And if the aircraft was still on the ground, it was by telephone, but once airborne, of course, by radio. So they had to have another look at how these maps were going to be arranged. And in fact, they finished up with something very similar, but with this flat table marked with the grid squares on which the plotters placed and moved all these blocks representing the different types of aircraft and the types of raid to represent the groups. And this was usually placed in the center of the station ops room. Now, round the walls, they could put all the other maps that were related to this. Now, this is where, in fact, the picture that you now mostly become familiar seeing on films and programs of the WAAFS round the table with galleries overlooking at it with the officers then carrying the information over and sending them to the station. So we're getting onto familiar territory here. So we finish up with this pretty well final organisation for about 1936, when Air Marshal Dowding was made the first Air Officer Commander-in-Chief. Fortunately, in this role, he remained directly responsible for the implementation of both the Biggin Hill studies, the training unit they've been having at Bawdsey, and of course, Bawdsey work itself. And it was because he had had this very direct interest and he was involved with the whole process from beginning to end. And this, in fact, was going to have a major bearing on the success of the Battle of Britain in 1940. It carried this air of continuity with it. Now, moving away from the early chain home area itself, by the end of 1937, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. I mean, people had been initially, England wasn't going to be armed, but the advance of the German Nazi structures throughout that period really was raising hackles, and the international situation was getting worse and worse. So they then made plans to extend this initial chain and put a final design for main stations rather than carry on with the first designs that they'd chosen. So they decided they'd have to start initially to operate on 4 wavebands as a safeguard against now possible jamming or accidental interference, although as such that had not yet happened. So for the final station, this is when you get the 4 360-foot steel towers that have now become the familiar sign of the chain home system that were to be used at each station for the transmitting aerials, and 4 240-foot wooden towers would carry on to be used for the receivers. Unfortunately, this was quite a considerable change in the construction methods and the requirements to actually produce the amount of steel and other materials. And so progress, in fact, was quite slow. Were put into operation with the original 240-foot wooden towers. And this is where the timing with Marconi, in fact, comes in, because although Marconi were involved in stringing arrays in the towers, but in the steel towers, they weren't actually involved in some of the early days. In fact, it was at such a level that some areas had to use a mobile station with portable 70-foot towers that had already been developed for overseas use by the Army. You will see in some of the photographs that follow that the 4 towers, in fact, were reduced to 3, because they eventually decided that they could string 2 sets of arrays between 2 outside towers and 1 central tower, rather than between 2 pairs of towers. That is why we get different shots. This first one shows what was called a typical East Coast station. And if you look at it, you will see a red letter A about 2/3 of the way up on the left-hand side. And you can fairly easily see 4 wooden receiver masts. If you look at the receipt over where you see the letter B, the red B, which are the transmitter towers, in fact, you can barely see them. This is because those steel towers, in fact, were quite thin. And so it's not surprising, some people regard, as to why perhaps there weren't as many attacks on these, because the shot that if you imagine you were an aircraft looking down at this picture, those transmitter towers are quite difficult to see. But the wooden receiver towers weren't. They seem to be the ones that got hit. This, however, is the more familiar picture that you now get with the CH tower, with the towers on the ground, with the 360-foot steel towers and the arrays between them, and the 4 wooden receiver towers off to one side. And that has become the standard picture, really, of CH radar. Now, that was the actual CH chain going in, and Watson Watt had already established that using this system, the propagational effects, again, working with the people at Baddow quite probably, would reduce the detection range possible for targets that came in at lower than standard cruising height. If they could go to shorter wavelengths, that would improve matters, if they could get more transmitter power and receiver sensitivity. And so, although a wavelength of 26 meters had been chosen for development, as the power available at this level tailed off very quickly, wavelengths between 10 and 15 for the main development might satisfy this REF requirement, the warning ranges of over 100 miles. But at Bawdsey, they not only had research going on for aircraft detection use, but the other military arms are also getting interested in this new radar. And so there were applications in the naval and military environments, and in another project called RDF2, of which more later, for which much shorter wavelengths were needed. And so they carried on experimenting and got wavelengths down to 50 centimeters. And this is when the first idea of the use of a beamed aerial rather than the floodlighting was thought about. And in fact, there was a concept of an RDF lighthouse with a continuously rotating beam to pick up targets. And this was put forward by another member of the Slough team, by E.G. Bowen. But then the realization of this was long before it was technically possible. But the idea started to float about. So we talked about the CH station, the detection, but not only was progress going on in this, but when the thought had started to come in about shorter wavelengths and how the interception were going to be carried out, another team in September 1936, led by Bowen, started working on this new idea of RDF2. The idea of this was to use shorter wavelengths to be able to reduce the size of equipment and actually mount the radar system on an aircraft. That could then greatly improve interception, and particularly at night, which was to prove useful after the initial daylight attacks. So they carried on with this experimental work on these higher frequencies, and they wanted to get down to 10 centimeters, but no way at that time could they get transmitters or get the receivers to work at that level. So they cobbled together, in fact, a fairly crude piece of kit, and they got down to 1.25 meters for both receiver and transmitter on an aircraft, an Anson, and they tested this in the summer of 1937. And with it, again, quite somewhat surprisingly, they managed to get range detection in excess of 5 miles on aircraft, but also on ships, because the aircraft, of course, was now above the sea and could look down as well as straight out in front. So we suddenly found ourselves now with two new developments, one called AI, air interception, and another ASV, air to surface vessel. And these both went ahead, but priority was given to AI at a wavelength of 1.5 meters, as they could get higher power at this on a reasonable receiver. And they wanted this to carry out better interception, particularly at night. The parallel progress also included now, of course, an army team who wanted to know how to use this, and they, by the end of 1937, developed a prototype anti-aircraft gun ranging kit, and which, after further development, they actually got into service in 1939. A subdivision of that army team, because they were going to look after the ground defense, and it was called Coastal Defense Subsection. After seeing the tests of the airborne intercept equipment on the roof at Bordsey, which is where they'd installed it, they decided to try and use this as the basis of this coastal defense system. And a lot of the techniques could be used directly. And in fact, they were less constrained because now they did not have to reduce the size to mount it on aircraft. The aircraft, in fact, had used a Yagi type aerial. And for those that don't know what that is, it's rather like the present television aerials. They opted to use what are called large broadside arrays, and they were about 24 foot wide and 10 foot high, which is more like the familiar radar aerials that people are used to seeing. But that did give them a much sharper beam and a very much higher gain. Not only were the army working on it, but the admiral was getting in on the act as well. And they decided the CH flood lighting system not only gave serious blind spots in cover, but they needed to operate over a full 360 degrees, because of course a ship sitting on the sea can be surrounded by other ships. It's not merely looking in one direction, it had to look all around. So they now started to think about beamed rotating aerials at masthead light of the ship. So there was a considerable amount of experimental work going on here, particularly at various wavelengths. In the 1936-37, they settled on something about 7 meters. Now, to carry this out properly, they actually needed two aerials, because you couldn't transmit and receive on the same aerial, because in those days, TR switching had been invented. The first installation, in fact, went on in HMS Sheffield, and work was all put in hand for locating service vessels as well. Now, the continuing development back on the CH system was that the RAF in August 1938, having taken over the system, carried out an exercise to test it. And the first thing that came out of this was it clearly showed that they needed better lower cover. Now, Watson Watt had predicted this, worked on the wavelengths and the structure they had, and a specific requirement was actually put forward from the RAF in June 1939. What the RAF did was, he said, could they have the equipment based on 1.5 meter coastal defense set being developed, but could they call that chain home low? So during this development, the RAF requirements were then established, and they decided that they really wanted to be able to detect aircraft now flying at 500 feet, at least 50 miles away, because the Germans were mounting low-level aircraft in, and they were going completely out of sight of the CH system. The coastal defense system had got about a 35-mile range, but actually it was decided that with the improved transmitters that were coming along, 50 miles was probably quite reasonable, but they need to site the aerials at about 200 feet above sea level to get the cover. Now, the RAF wanted the CHL lows to be placed at the CHS stations, but it wasn't really very suitable. So they conceived the idea of mounting the CH aerials on towers. And in fact, this was a type 2 type of tower, which wasn't seen very often. But as far as I know, there are none of these left. So we have to depend on photographs for this. Continued development also being done by the Army. They were told off to expand their practices and to provide 24 of their variety of radar, the CHL lane equipments for the RAF, in addition to their coastal defence system. And now they had decided they had a pair of broadside aerials, 20 feet wide by 10 feet high, and they mounted these on searchlight tables, mounted on 2 pairs of 20-foot high wooden galleries, and they put these over huts to enclose the transmitter receiver systems. They actually turned the aerials by using very crude bicycle chain drives. They actually had people inside the hut actually riding the sort of bike-sized system to turn the aerials, and they had to keep them in step. So after detecting a target, the receiver aerial had to be inched around to point straight at the target so that the direction would be read off, and with a range given on the cathode ray tube, enable a map position to be plotted. So this was apparently quite an exhausting exercise for the crew that had to drive these aerials around. And so they had to have quite frequent changes. There is, as far as I know, no real CHL around, but we haven't discovered that at Baddow, up near the tower, one of the old CHL stands has actually been used there to do tests on aerials. So although the aerial mounted at the top of that wasn't a CHL aerial, that is the type of stand that would have been mounted at the CHL stations in addition to the CH. Development was also continuing in the Navy. And this gentleman, Admiral Sir James Jewett, had seen one of the CD sets tracking a surface submarine at Bawdsey, as they were doing this off the coast, of course. And he said, could this equipment not be used to help protect Scapa Flow, the main US base up in Scotland, where it had been, where it was the site in touch of a U-boat sinking in late 39. So they took some of the Bawdsey equipment to the Cavendish laboratories at Cambridge and designed and constructed a new set called the CDU, which U for U-boat. They had one of these operating in December and 2 more by the end of the February. And they found that performance on submarines could be up to 25 miles. And of course, on aircraft as well, and that was up to 70 miles. And they were able to detect low-flying aircraft at much greater ranges than the CH stations. So they added this development to that of the Chain Home Low system, and eventually a version of this was actually turned into the ground control interception, the GCI technique, which of course eventually resulted in the Type 7 aerial, which quite a lot of us are familiar. Now, while all this was going on, they had been concerned, of course, all this time, the Germans might become aware of the work that was going on at Bawdsey. And in fact, that was heightened by the reported and famous visit from the Graf Zeppelin, which is for almost a whole day, as it said in August 1939, hovered out to sea and also actually ventured in over the coast. And quite correctly, it was thought that they were trying to monitor what was going on at these mysterious towers that they'd seen being built. And it was assumed that if the Germans knew Bawdsey function, it would make one of their earliest bombing targets. However, quite often, to several people's surprise, the Germans, it was found out later, actually dismissed their observations of no consequence, as they did not conform to what they had actually designed in the way of their radars. they had in fact designed the whole new radar system much more like the original, much more like the version that we were familiar with big dishes. But they were not using it for defensive purposes in the same way. And it worked at frequencies much higher than at those that we were being used. So they decided that no way could this equipment be used for radar and must be some weird form of communication system. And so they decided it was of no consequence, rather fortunately for us. Meanwhile, at Bawdsey, not long before the declaration of war, because of this, most of the Bawdsey radar people were evacuated up to Dundee, just in case, because of course we didn't know at that time that the Germans had not decided that Bawdsey was worth attacking. The Bowen airborne equipment team went up to Scone near Perth, and the army team was moved to Christchurch, actually much better for their work. So in fact, the work at Bawdsey got rather, not exactly to fall apart, but because it got moved around the country subsequently, the research was really done mostly on local stations. But it no longer really concerned CH, which had by now become an established system. So now we need to look at how all this was actually used. You look at this very simple diagram. So far, really what we've talked about is the square at top left, the radars. They were now in full operation. They were working through the filter room fighter command into the group headquarters. But as we've already said, they need to convey that information down to the sector airfields, which actually control where the fighters were. They also had to work with other services, which included barrage balloons and anti-aircraft stations and things like that. And the other section over to the left, which is called satellites, not the satellites we would think of now. The satellites were other aerodromes connected to the main one, which also provided services of aircraft. But feeding into sector control were two other structures, as you see. One, the observer corps, and two, the DS stations. And it is those that we need to look at as well, because they form an important part of the system in that they were really concerned with the control of the fighters rather than the enemy, because although we had now got the radars doing the detection, we now had to get the fighters there in the proper place at the proper time. And this is came in. Now, all of these on this diagram, all of these sections are just linked together by lines. But don't forget, those lines actually represent a very enhanced landline communication system, which is supplied by the General Post Office. And we'll talk about that a little later. So here we have now a fully operating chain home receiver station with the crew here panning the plotting table, and also on the left-hand side, a WAAF using the system. And here is a closer view of her looking at the screen in front of her. And over on this left-hand side, the large knob is the one that she used to turn to find range and various other parameters. So it was quite a skilled job. They did have a little hope, although they had mainly got rid of having to do calculations. They still had to do some to get the target height, the real target height, and they did have the benefit of a very simple, you could call it a computer, I suppose, but really it was a calculator. They call it a fruit machine. It didn't have a program in the way we'd think of it now, but it had a hardwire structure which had been put into it by tracking an aircraft in front of the station or an artiggero, and on a series of known courses and tracks, so they could calibrate how it worked. So from the inputs of the target range, the target bearing, the target height, given to them by the radar, building in the known earth curvature, they got an output with a corrected target height for the incoming raid. Each station had to be regularly calibrated because of propagation conditions. This is the RDF coverage that was available during 1939-40, and you may not be able to quite read the caption, but the dotted line is the cover at September 1939, and you can see it sort of extends quite well out, finishes round about the Southampton area, has a break just before it gets really up into Scotland. But by September 1939, the solid line cover was in place, which goes right out and also comes right round to the west coast. There is also the sort of fuzzy shaded area, and this was the low cover, provided in most cases by the CHL, but round the various port areas, there was another version called Chain Home Extra Low, and this was used to survey the land area and the sea area around ports. So if any intruding E-boats and so forth came in, there was a chance of seeing them on radar. And that you'll see, in fact, covers not just over on the east coast, but goes right round on the west coast at Liverpool and other ports around there. But that was the coverage, and it is worth remembering that you are looking at the length of the British Isles. So, going back to the other two supporting areas, the Royal Observer Corps. Now, they had roots, in fact, in the First World War, and the requirement was then for a warning system to bolster the defences against the bombing raids by Zeppelins and other German aircraft. So they had already been involved in this type of work. What was put together was a system of observation posts and the observers, and they had a network of about 200, mainly in the metropolitan area. It was initially manned by the British Army, but they were replaced by effectively a civilian service of special police constables. Now, the post coordinated on an area, and they had the telephone communications. This is where the GPO started to come in, between themselves and the associated, in those days, anti-aircraft defences. They were replaced not long after the war by the Metropolitan Observation Service, and they had lessons, of course, learned for future developments from the aircraft observation, the identification and the reporting structure. And in 1924, they carried out a series of trials to develop what they call the RAID reporting system. And in 1925, these trials were extended and the whole new organisation was formed, now to be known as the Observer Corps. Again, it was a civilian operation. The observers were recruited as special constables, and each post was manned by a sergeant and 6 constables. But in 1929, the control of the Observer Corps passed from the county police to the Air Ministry, so they became part of the Dowding system at that point. And they moved to a new headquarters at RAF Uxbridge, which in fact during the Second World War was one of the main sector operation centres, and they now had an Air Commodore as their commandant. And by 1939, they had moved from being a cover mainly around the metropolitan area to cover virtually the whole of the Great Britain. And they now reported into the fighter headquarters at RAF Bentley. They were, in fact, now still the Observer Corps, but after the war, King George VI in April 41, in recognition of the service that they provided during the war, awarded them the title Royal, and they're of course known by that title now on. So during the wartime service in World War II, the significant dates on the 24th of August, the Chief Constables issued the mobilisation notices to all their members, with war being declared just 10 days afterwards. So then they were conscripted into that service full time. And from the 3rd of September 39, right through until the 12th of May 1945, all the observation posts and control centres were manned continuously 24 hours a day. Now, the Chain Home Station only warned of aircraft approaching the coast. It was facing outwards from the coast towards France. Once across the coastline, the Observer Corps then provided the only means of tracking their position. The CH stations did not look backwards inland. So during the period from July to October 1940, which is the Battle of Britain period we're talking about, The Observer Corps were obviously working at full stretch, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And they were plotting the enemy aircraft and pressing the information to the fighter command and sector controls, and therefore forming this cornerstone of the Air Marshal Dowding system. This was really recognized because there is a dispatch on record from Air Marshal Dowding following the Britain stating, "It is important to note that at this time they, the Observer Corps, constituted the whole means of tracking enemy raids once they had crossed the coastline. Their work throughout was quite invaluable. Without it, the air raid warning system could not have been operated and inline interceptions would rarely have been made." So this is a sign of the fact that this was part of the necessary support system. The next part was the direction finding for the fighters, and this is where we get these two names which are familiar, Huff Duff and Pipsqueak. Now, prior to the Battle of Britain, as we said, the CH station was located as far forward as possible along the shoreline to get the maximum warning time of the German raids coming over from the French coast. So the inland areas did not have the coverage, relying on the Royal Observer Corps. Now, they were able to do this for the large incoming raids, but the individual fighters are too small and too high to be positively identified. And the Dowding system actually relied on ground direction, so they had to find some way of doing this solving this fighter location problem. This was done by using what became known as HFDF, or high frequency direction finding, sometimes known as HEFDF, and usually by HFDF. It was in fact a type of radio direction finding introduced in World War II, and it has a set of antennae rather in the same way as had been used in the chain home system, of being spaced at slightly different locations, and these location differences were then used to obtain a bearing to the transmitter. It was all actually sat on a development, again originated by Watts and Watt, for lightning location. But it was, of course, referring back to where we started, a technique used in World War I for naval and aerial navigation, also provided by the Marconi Company. If you remember, the Battery of Jutland in World War I was mainly fought under the direction of land-based Marconi direction finding systems. And in fact, the equipment they were using in 940 was a Marconi type DFG-12. So this is where Marconi really comes to the fore in the Battle of Britain story. This was a typical Adcock array, as it was known, station with the aerials and the receiving hut around. The way it was worked was that each sector control into which they fed was in charge of a selection of fighter squadrons, and it was equipped itself with a HFDF receiver, but it had two other substations located about 30 miles away. Now, all of these stations listened in for broadcasts, and then by comparing the angles from the different stations, they could triangulate the location, and then that information was relayed to the control rooms. So comparing the positions of the enemy reported by the RAC or DF, and then the fighters from the HFDF system, the sector commanders in the control rooms could then direct the fighters to intercept the enemy. So this was the necessary method of getting the fighters to the appropriate point. Now, to aid in this process, the other system known as Pipsqueak was used, and this was installed on some of the fighters. And it automatically sent out a steady tone every minute, offering time for the HFDF operators to track. The only problem was it tied up the aircraft's radio while broadcasting the signal, but normally this was one aircraft in a flight, so it didn't really affect the situation as regards the positioning of the fighters. This, in fact, is the equipment they use, the DFG-12DF Mark II. This was the manually operated one, and towards the end, the Mark III came in, and this was an automatic system where instead of a hand control, it was fully operated with a cathode ray tube showing the results. So this was real Marconi equipment. The other arm, which I pointed out really was only represented on the diagram by lines, was the post office. Now, Brentley Priory was established then as the communication centre. If you remember, we already mentioned this as becoming the headquarters also of the ROC. And it had at its focus the operations room. Now, it was the only communication centre that was in touch with all defence stations and information sources. So it displayed everything about everything over the whole of the Great Britain and its sea approaches. So the C&C, which was Air Marshal Dowding, could observe all the air picture, coordinate the activities not only of the Air Force, but also the Army and Navy, and of course the different commands, in other words, the fighter group and sector controllers in their areas. So to control aircraft operating in these areas, obviously radio telephone facilities are used. But for raid reporting, they had a teleprinter network as well. Now, all of this involved this vast landline telephone communication segment, which had been provided by teams of post office engineers. And in fact, on TV tonight, there was an interview with one of them who reported how he got caught on one of the stations while it was being bombed. They'd actually been doing this work from as early as 1925. The final supporting group, which was a completely separate unit but needs to be talked about, was the Air Transport Auxiliary. This has been mentioned before. It was another civilizing organisation which took over from the service pilots the task of ferrying the aircraft between the factories, the maintenance units and the frontline squadrons. And there were many, so as it says here, 1,250 men and women from 25 countries in the end who ferried this total of aircraft of 147 different types. Not all, of course, for the Battle of Britain, but they certainly did their part in playing the replacement of Spitfires and Hurricanes as necessary from the factories. And they did this for themselves with, as they've said before in various programs, no radios, no instrument flying, and at the mercy of the weather. And quite often presented with the type of aircraft they had never seen before. They were a very brave bunch of people. So here we are. This was the situation during the Battle of Britain. We have the coastal services seen on this diagram, the various groups, the sector groups, the headquarters, the points of radar. It was an extremely complicated structure, and they all had to pull together to achieve success. So this was, as I said, not just the aircraft themselves, but dependent on the other supporting groups, of which Marconi was just the one. This is a rather interesting painting. I'm not quite sure now who commissioned it. Somebody might remember, by Chris French. And it shows an amalgam of how the whole system actually worked. You've got 3 of the steel towers with the transmitter antenna. On the lower left, you've got the girl actually on the tube in the CH station interpreting the blips. Information was sent by the telephone over on the right-hand side and updated by the plotter, top right. And the markers representing the hostile and friendly aircraft were used to plan the battles. They've got one particular squadron named here, 234 Squadron Spitfires, top left, peeling off to intercept the enemy. And the succession of functions became known, as they say, as read, report, filter, identify, tell, and plot. It is really quite a neat way of representing the entire system. One thing that is of interest, I think, is the personnel involved. This particular picture shows it. You have seen something like it before, but a significant proportion of service personnel who served in the ops environments were female. And in fact, there is a record of one WAAFS radar operator on one of the CH stations by the name of Iris Haim at RAF Poling, stayed at her post while bombs rained down during one of the few occasions when the stations were bombed, and she actually was awarded the military medal. So even the girls on the ground in the ops stations were really on the front line. It also has to be remembered that although we talk about the Battle of Britain as if this section from the July to October of 40 was the main part, which it was, it didn't end there. The battle actually continued with more and more bombers coming in well into and beyond 1941, when the Luftwaffe moved to the Nitrifacts, and the development of the RDF-2, which was the airborne radar, really became a priority. And it was also increased in use by military and naval forces. So this required continuing extensive work. And this is again where Marconi came in. A lot of this work went on inside the Marconi organization, not just Baddow. Really, to sum up what I hope I've managed to convey was that the supporter contributions, it was the way they all came together to meet this threat of the German invasion, and the fact that the government utilized themselves, industrial resources, combined the work that had gone on from the First World War, which is existing equipment, and really funded the design. It's quite a heavy decision to make, to invest that amount of money on a new system of control and communication. And the civilian and armed services came together to make best use of all of these, and they provided the frontline aircraft people with the support, and they collectively secured the safety of the realm at the outbreak of war. Now, this in fact was recognized by both sides, and there's three very interesting little remarks in a particular book by George Smith on the Brunabel raid, and he was talking about something which came later. And it's interesting to read what he said. If the British had failed in many respects to ready themselves for the fight against Nazi Germany, they had done wonders with their early warning system. They had been as thorough and as painstaking as they had been inventive. Invisible walls had been built around the United Kingdom, walls 12 miles high and 120 miles thick, and also, of course, the full length, over 600 miles of the British Isles. H.G. Wells himself could never have imagined such defences. And Reich Marshal Göring himself wanted to comment. He was recorded as saying, "We must admit that in this sphere, the British and the Americans are far ahead of us. I expected them to be advanced, but I never thought they would get so far ahead. I did hope that even if we were behind, we could at least be in the same race." And Winston Churchill, with one of his famous remarks again, "All the ascendancy of the Hurricanes and Spitfires would have been fruitless, but for this system which had been devised and built before the war. It had been shaped and refined in constant action, and was now fused together into a most elaborate instrument of war, the like of which existed nowhere in the world. That's why we were able to defeat the Germans." Just to finish off on a Marconi note, Marconi did work on RDF post the early days, as I said. They provided all the rigging teams for the curtain arrays between the 360-foot seal towers when they were erected, and also the rigging for receiver towers. And I managed to find this photograph of a team of Marconi riggers sitting at the base of one of these towers on one of the, I think it was one of the West Coast stations. Now, the West Coast stations, which were featured on the diagram, in fact, were a completely different set of stations in that they didn't use the towers. They used 360-foot guide masts of Marconi design, and the arrays were mounted in a slightly different way for these stations, and that was completely done by the Marconi Company. And we mustn't forget that through the requisition resources of Baddow, and don't forget, Baddow was effectively taken over completely as a government establishment, They did carry out work on the development of the magnetron, although the original work was done at Birmingham and, of course, GEC research labs. They developed the magnetron for the centimetric radar, which came later. They continued development of the HFDF systems at Baddow right through the war. And Eckersley and his people in the propagation department maintained propagation studies, mainly which were applied to the communication structures rather than radar, but almost certainly helped at the beginning with the work that Slough carried out. We also made other rather famous, the TR 1154, 1155 radio and communications for aircraft. It may not be well known that we also made secret suitcase radios for agents, which were dropped them in France. There were also many fixed and mobile installations for ground forces on the land and at the sea, and these were used by many people during all major parts of the war, when requisition coaches were transformed into mobile communication systems in New Street and then shipped abroad. And there were many specialized components, such as the piezoelectric crystals that were made of this. There was also work being done, and I've discovered in the archives at Oxford, with the help of the Marconi curator there, some what was secret, but which is now, in fact, of course, declassified documentation, indicating that work at Brittle and at Baddow was being conducted at Marconi's and in communication with the RDF2 people, in other words, the airborne people at Maudsley on aircraft detection systems. There is more work to be looked at there to try and find more information about our connection. So rather more than some people expected. We were continued to be involved in the DF side by quite a lot. And in 4041, we actually were involved with the fitting with the Navy of early warning against air attack to the Navy capitalist ships. And we were involved in the modification of the air-to-surface metric equipment to small ships. And we also got involved in this crash program to develop the small submarine set. And an improved form of aircraft warning came out of this, the Type 281. Also, what happened in many cases was the second thing. Two senior engineers were seconded to the Admiralty to devise countermeasures to the German radars sighted along the coast of France. And in fact, following improvements of the magnetron, the New Street factory produced an amplifier unit for the new naval radar Type 271. And there was a new centimetric radar AS3 for the RAF. Now, in 1942, magnetron production was moved to this new building at Waterhouse Lane, now known as, of course, E2V, enabling a delivery of several hundred per month. And it's interesting, following the acquisition by English Electric in 1946, this became EEV. It is now Teledyne E2V, and with Leonardo in Basildon are the only two Marconi-related remnants, I believe, still in the Chelmsford area. But coming to the end of the war, for the 1944 D-Day, Marconi designed, developed and manufactured, this time from research carried out at TRE, which was a successor to Maudsley, an airborne system which was codenamed Bagful, to intercept, record the frequency and approximate positions of A&E radar stations, and this was in large-scale operation prior to the invasion, to build up a dossier. As a consequence of this, on June the 6th itself, a multiplicity of jamming stations in an operation known Carpet paralyzed the German radar network. Also, for the invasion, Marconi Marine provided servicing for all radio, echo sounding and radar equipments. So we were heavily involved post the actual Battle of Britain, but that's really our main topic for tonight. Just to finish off as a postscript, because of all this technical in development during the war, as ever, unfortunately, war is very often the progenitor of very large technical advances. And of course, this was the same here. And it was picked up by UK companies, including Marconi. And in fact, the Marconi Company undertook the refurbishment of existing installations, including training of engineers and tradesmen to rebuild the CH stations immediately after war, because they continued in use until the 1950s. But a new radar development group was established at Broomfield. Not only that, the company created new TRADAR divisions, and one of them was the Service Equipment Division. And this became the supply of radio and radar equipment for British Services Design. This is what eventually transmogrified into Marconi Radar Division, and eventually, when the absorption through GEC of other companies happened, the Marconi Radar Systems Limited as a standalone company. We actually moved into civil work by re-engineering the Wartime Type 11 50 centimetre transmitter. That was a work that was totally done by the company. But perhaps more importantly, the government awarded a study contract post-war to rebuild the RAF radar defences, and it was awarded to the company. And the study resulting from that was adopted by the ministry, and it required the design and manufacture of new fixed and mobile stations. This was called WAAFS and Rota. And this 6-year programme was completed by 1955, within months of the target date. So we did in fact do pretty well the major refixing of the radar system for the RAF post-war. Just as a slightly amusing finish, Baddeau eventually, of course, was nearly returned to civilian status. And those of you who were in the company will know of Roy Simons, and he was then a junior technical assistant in the research division at Baddeau. And as we all know, he later became the first technical director of the Marconi Radar Systems Limited. And he reports in his memoirs that with the end of the war, the DF work was run down, and the head of Section K, R.J. Kemp, marched into the laboratory, announced suddenly that we are going to do radar, and marched out. And so they did. And that's where we were until the Marconi Company finally finished. Thank you for listening, everybody, and I hope it has been of interest.